Welcome, everyone. We'll go ahead and get started. Thank you so much for being here. Welcome to the 2023 Johnson County Library Writers Conference. This program is being recorded, and it will be available in Library on Demand following the session. We are grateful to the Joanne Berkeley Writers Fund, administered by the Johnson County Library Foundation, for their ongoing financial support for our writing programs. My name is Jessica. I work here at the library, and I'm on the Writers Conference, so I help plan the conference this year. It's our 9th annual Writers Conference, so check out our For Writers page for more information about writing contests, our blog, other resources, and events. If you happen to tag us on social media, don't forget to include the hashtag JoCoWrites. There will be time at the end for questions, and I'll go ahead and introduce our presenter. Thank you for coming to When to Show versus Tell with Dr. Amber A. Logan. Amber is a university professor, freelance editor, and author of speculative fiction, living in Overland Park, Kansas, with her husband and 2 children. In addition to her degrees in psychology, liberal arts, and international relations, Amber holds a PhD in creative writing from Anglia Ruskin University in Cambridge, England. Amber's debut novel, The Secret Garden of Yanagi Inn, is an adult contemporary Gothic retelling of the children's classic, The Secret Garden, set near Kyoto, Japan. When she's not writing, Amber enjoys trips to Japan, exploring unusual vegetarian foods, and reading Haruki Murakami. Please join me in welcoming Amber A. Logan.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Jessica. So I'm here today to talk about when to show versus tell. So just a few housekeeping notes up front. Like Jessica said, we will have questions at the end, but if you have any, burning questions partway through, do feel free to raise your hand. I want to keep this kind of casual a conversation. If you need to leave, I promise I will not be offended. I know there's a lot going on today, so just try to do it quietly. And I do have a sign-up sheet if anybody's interested in getting copies of these slides emailed to you. I will pass this around. There is an optional check if you want to sign up for a newsletter. That is not required, but I am happy to send the slides if you're interested. So I will pass that around real quick. Okay, so let's get started. You already had a brief introduction of me, but again, I am Dr. Amber A. Logan. I have PhD in creative writing. I'm a university professor. I teach here locally for Baker University and Avila University on the Kansas City side, on the Missouri side. And then I also teach graduate creative writing courses for Southern New Hampshire University. I'm a freelance editor, means I do work directly with authors on editing their manuscripts. And then I am the author of The Secret Garden of Yanagi Inn, which was my debut novel that came out last November. And I believe it should, thank you, I believe it should be on sale in the conference bookstore, which is kind of back in the corner there. Or afterwards, if you want to come flip through it, you're welcome to. And I do have some free bookmarks and business cards if anybody is interested. So what are we going to talk about today? We are going to cover what does show, don't tell even mean? And then we have 2 different types of show versus tell. We have the macro and the micro. We'll be covering both of those. And just as kind of an aside, I've never actually heard anybody describe it this way before, so this is kind of my own interpretation, but one important thing that I always like to tell my students is there's no one right way to write. If it works for you, great. If it doesn't work for you, if this doesn't make sense to you, there's plenty of resources out there that explain this concept, but you're getting my take on it today. And then finally, we'll talk about how to blend show and tell, because honestly, that's the best of both worlds. This does not have to be a black and white dichotomy. And then at the very end, like I said, we will have time for like a formal Q&A. So, what does show, don't tell mean? This is something that I'm guessing most of you writers out there have heard before. Does anybody want to venture their own description of what that means or throw out a definition of one or the other? Somebody's brave. I know. Yes, in the back.
For me, show, don't tell really means like describe something in concrete terms, like what you'd be seeing.
Excellent.
From another perspective, or from the narrator's perspective, instead of just saying something more abstract. Like instead of saying she looks sad, say like she was
Exactly, yeah. And to recap there, it's basically saying that showing is giving concrete sensory type details, not just kind of summarizing. Instead of saying she was sad, which would be telling, showing would be showing us basically what a camera could pick up on, or what a microphone could pick up on, or these are the little sensory details that bring the situation to life rather than just being told it abstractly. So I have a favorite quote from Chekhov that says, "Don't tell me the moon is shining. Show me the glint of light on broken glass." And I think that kind of epitomizes the show versus tell. The glint of light on broken glass, suddenly you have an image in your mind, and that's what showing does for you. But this does not mean, however, that you should always show. And I'll get into the reasons behind why you don't always want to show here in a moment. So like I said, we have the macro, and then we have the micro. So on the macro level, we're really talking about the scene level. So when you're doing your outlining or you're sitting down to draft the first version of your book, you have decisions to make, whether you're consciously thinking about this or not. Say you know you're going to have a party in your novel at some point. You have to actually make a decision. Am I going to show real time what is happening in that party because it is important? Or am I just going to kind of gloss over it, narrate it after the fact, or even just say, after the party, and continue on? This is the kind of show versus tell decision that we're talking about at the macro level. At the micro level, we're really talking about the sentence and word level. So like she was saying in the back there, that's more of the, she was crying and trembling, etc. That's the micro, the minute things we're going to look at. And why is this important? Because of proportion, emphasis, and pacing, which will come. So at the macro level, the scene level, you make the choice of whether you're going to dramatize or you're going to narrate. So dramatize, just hearing the word dramatization, you think plays or movies, right? Because you are watching something as it plays out in real time, in a specific setting, usually providing very specific sensory details. It's going to come across as vivid and cinematic. It's also going to feel very close to the reader. When the reader is reading something that's dramatized, they should feel like they are in the scene with your characters walking around on the page. And it should be engaging. The reader is involved in interpreting what is on the page. They're not being told, she is sad. They're seeing the physical manifestations of this sadness, and in their brain they're thinking, oh, she's really sad. And readers like that. They like to feel like they are part of the process. They have to do their own interpretations to get to the conclusions that you're just giving them the clues, leading them towards. So dramatization is also going to have things like dialogue, with actual quotation marks and internal thoughts. Because once again, we are in real time. If somebody's talking, we're getting their individual words, not just a summary of, we had an argument about the party, right? That would be the narrating version of a conversation. So dramatization then is showing on this big macro sense. So the narration, in contrast, is kind of a fast forwarding that you do when you're writing. You're doing a condensed time frame. Instead of scene by scene seeing what happens at that party, we're getting the party was a success. You summed up a 4-hour event in one sentence, right? But you can convey information very quickly this way, and it summarizes, large blocks of time or content into a very small package. It is usually more distant, and it is more passive. And I don't mean passive like the ball was hit by the bat. I mean passive in that the reader doesn't have to do anything to absorb the information. She is sad. Okay, you know that she's sad. You didn't have to put your brain to work to figure that out, and therefore it's not quite as satisfying. So that's what the telling is in this scene. So narration versus dramatization. So an example, this is just something that I made up. Dramatization, example. So here's a scene. What do you mean we're out of Pringles? I glowered at Richard, who was clearly looking out the car window to avoid my gaze. Well, what do you expect when we only stop for meals a few times a day? Richard grumbled. I sat back with a sigh. How was I going to survive another 24 hours on the road with these guys? So you can see in there we're getting actual dialogue, words said, quotes around it. We're getting a setting where they're looking out of a car window. You're like, okay, we are in the car with the characters. We get the thoughts. She's like, how am I going to survive, right? There's grumbling. That's a clear example of dramatization. If you decided, though, when you were writing your book, that maybe we don't need to see the blow-by-blow of this car trip, you could narrate that scene instead. You could sum that up with, the 2-day car trip was largely uneventful, but by the end of it, we were all sick of each other, right? If that's the only message that you need to convey, is that it was 2 days, it was a car, we got from point A to point B, by the end, maybe the relationships are a little bit more rocky. Great, you did it in one sentence instead of presumably pages and pages and pages of showing this car trip. So you can see the advantages and disadvantages of your dramatization versus your narration. So the question is, though, when should you dramatize versus narrate? And it really comes down to emphasis. So what you want to tell your reader is important. And proportion, how much of your book does this particular event, this party, deserve? Does it need to be, 2 full chapters of a party? Or can it be 1 paragraph? And it depends on what you want to emphasize as important. It also affects your pacing. So if you will never see you will rarely see a book. I never want to say never because there are books with every kind of format and structure you can imagine, but you will rarely see a book that is 100% showing because it would be a drag. You would get people sleeping for hours. You would get every meal they had, every shower they took, every drive to their office. It would just be very boring, right? You would know, even if a reader who knows nothing about structure and pacing would be like, this is wrong. There's something wrong here. We need to skip some stuff, right? So making this decision, dramatize versus narrate, can really help with pacing. So if you find yourself maybe you finished your first draft of your novel and you're going back and looking at it and you're like, people talk about the saggy middle. The middle of the draft doesn't feel quite right. Maybe there's not enough happening. Look at each scene and think, should I be dramatizing or should I be narrating? Maybe some of those scenes you can summarize in 1 paragraph, and guess what? Suddenly your book speeds up in the middle there. So specifically, when you want to dramatize, like I said, it's basically when you want things to slow down a little bit. So when there are moments of high drama, if there is a car chase, it is far more exciting and engaging to get the blow-by-blow of the car chase. I mean, imagine if you're reading a thriller and you start a new chapter and they say, well, the car chase took 20 minutes, but it ended up with both cars in the river. You'd be like, hold on, I want to see that on the page. That's a moment of high drama. That's something that you should probably have on the page in real time. Moments of conflict. You have a battle. You have an argument that is going to matter to the characters. That should probably be dramatized and on the page. Important plot points. And this can also be very genre specific. So say you are writing a romance, your meet cute should probably be dramatized. You shouldn't have an after the fact, oh yeah, then I bumped into this cute guy at the cafe and we spilled coffee all over each other. 1 sentence is not going to cut it, right? Readers have expectations of what scenes you are actually presenting to them. And so that's something you can ask yourself too, is be like, well, what are those major plot points in my story? What do my readers want to see on the page? I was actually listening to a podcast yesterday, and I can't remember which one it was, but it was a screenwriter, and he was saying that somebody told him that to think about when he was deciding which scenes to convert into, because he was taking a novel and turning it into a screenplay, and he was advised to think what you want to be on your trailer, right? Those are the high impact, the explosions, the people slapping each other, or whatever, think about your genre. But those are the scenes you really, really need to actually dramatize, right? Like your climax, for example. Major battle at the end, you do not say, and then there was a battle and everybody was happy. right? That will feel weird to people, even if they don't know exactly why, because they want to see it dramatized. Events that have been foreshadowed. You would think that this is obvious, but I have seen many examples when I've been editing client manuscripts where the author will lead up to an event. Like, for example, there was one I was reading, it was a YA, and there was a dance. Like, it was, I don't think it was prom, but something like that. And the character was like agonizing over this girl he was going to ask, and we get all these details. We find out that she's going to go get a dress and blah, blah, blah. And then the dance itself was like a paragraph. And I was like, you foreshadowed this so much. You led me to believe this was going to be a big event because of the proportion of the lead up to that. So much page was spent telling me this is going to be a big deal, and then it wasn't. And I was just like, oh my gosh, no, you have to show that dance. We were expecting this dance. So if you have foreshadowed something, then you need to show it. And if you realize, wait, I really don't need to show this, take out the clues leading up to it so readers won't think this important event is coming, which ends up not being important. So similar to what I was saying about the genre-specific plot points, character relationship dynamics. You want to make sure that characterization is done through showing, generally speaking. Again, I never want to say always, there's always exceptions, but if your main characters have a fight and that leads to them breaking up, again, those important relationship dynamics need to be on the page, not summarized. Opening scenes and introductions. Just generally speaking, it is advised you should start your book in a real-time setting. Get people invested in what is happening in real time. We don't need all the backstory, but we need to see character introductions live, preferably. We don't want to be told, here is Jane, she is 24 years old, and she is blonde, and she, etc. We want to see Jane walking around when she bumps into the cute guy in the cafe or whatever, right? We want to see characters coming on stage, introduced for the first time. We would like to see those scenes. They will be more memorable and they will mean more to your reader. Similarly, the important backstory. Sometimes backstory, we only want to have a sentence or two. But if there's a significant moment that shows the trauma that your main character experienced as a child, maybe, a few sentences or paragraphs isn't really going to cut it. Maybe you actually need to dedicate a chapter to showing that backstory in real time, in scene, with emotions. So it's something to consider. And that is one thing that I often will advise to clients as well. It's like, look at your flashbacks. Do you need it to be real time, or is it better to just be narrated? Only you will be able to answer that, or your critique partners can help. So when is it best to narrate? So the short answer is when you want to fast forward things. When what you are wanting to convey doesn't need to be a long, drawn-out scene. You just need somebody to get this information. So when you have situations that are low stakes, going back to that car example that we had earlier, if the characters arguing in the car doesn't really matter and they're still friends at the end, they're just kind of grumpy with each other, yeah, that's a pretty low stakes situation. We don't need to see the blow by blow. So we could probably just narrate that scene in a few sentences and move on. When there are situations of smooth sailing, if everything's going great for your character, it's not very exciting to read, right? We like to read about drama and conflict. Obviously, short paragraphs about things going well can be fine, but if you have long stretches of time where not very much happens, it's a good time to hit the fast forward button and just narrate that scene instead. Similarly, mundane life, meals, showers, travel. Unless there's amazing epiphanies that happen to the person in the shower, like happens to me all the time, then you don't need to have that on the page. You can summarize and say, got up, took my shower, drove to work. That's almost invisible to readers to see that. They're like, oh, okay, dun, dun, dun. We're moving on. Repetitive scenes, if you have a situation where maybe you have somebody who's in the ER and they take care of patients all the time, maybe the first one you show all the drama and you give us a real-time scene, but in subsequent times you can just imply, and then I had 3 people with bullets. stuck in their heads. And then I had this, and then I had this, right? We don't need to have a dedicated scene. Even if it is exciting, you can kind of use shorthand at that point to say, okay, you knew what happened earlier. Yeah, that thing, it happened again. So minor backstory, like I said, each time you have a flashback or a piece of backstory you think should be included for your reader to understand the story, ask yourself, is it important enough that I am hanging a lantern on this? I want people to really focus on this scene, or is it something that they just need to know that she was in a car crash when she was 12, and then we can move on? Time jumps, if your character gets a new job and the first 6 months of it are uneventful, 6 months later, start your paragraph, right? I love date stamps for that reason. They are very much telling. I mean, if you just say 6 months passed, you could not be more blatantly on the nose telling people, hey, guess what? 6 months passed. You don't have to be like, and now there's Christmas trees up and we were on the beach before. No, just say 6 months. It's fine. Readers accept it as part of the structure of the story, and we'll move on. Transitional moments, I'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment. But essentially, like I was saying, passage of time, traveling, those kinds of things where we don't need the blow-by-blows, but we might need to know that time passed. So essentially, you narrate anytime there's events that your reader needs to know that it did happen, but it does not need to be on the page. So if a scene can be narrated without losing meaning, it probably should be, right? So we can take discipline to be like, I wrote this gorgeous scene and it's got all this great dialogue, but when you look at it, you realize, but nothing really happens that the reader needs to see. I can make it 2 lines and move on, and the speed of my story will go so much better, so much faster. So coming back to the narrating transitions between scenes, I wanted to give just a couple examples. First one is actually from my book, so The Secret Garden of Yanagi Inn. My fever was gone, my hair was washed, and my belly was reasonably satiated with a few bites of eggs and grapes. So we don't need to know that she woke up after an illness and realized she was feeling fine, that she finally went and took her shower and she ate some breakfast. One sentence, I summarized all that. That's all we need to know. It's like, oh, she's feeling better, she's getting back to normal, and she ate something, now we're ready for an adventure. So similarly, with travel, this is from The Tyranny of Faith by Richard Swan, which is a great fantasy series. We returned to the Temple of Savar, this time mounted on horses and with a group of imperial guard and city watchmen with us to make arrests. So that could be a pretty good chunk of time there. I mean, they had been out like in the countryside, I think, and now they're returning to a temple. They stopped to pick up these guards and city watchmen along the way. You could see how there might be a temptation to be like, well, this could be interesting. Maybe we had to convince the guards to come with us, or maybe there's a small altercation. It's like, yeah. Or you could summarize it in one sentence, and suddenly we know exactly what the scene is when we're moving in. So these will often come, in fact, I think both of these might be at the very beginning of a chapter. A lot of times that is a really good time, a point of transition, where we're jumping time, jumping scenery. Often you can start with a really solid narration and then jump into your real-time scene. This can be very effective. And if you start looking through books, flip and look, what is happening at the beginning of the chapter? Are we getting a transition, or are we jumping straight in scene, and think, why did the author choose to make that decision? Because I can guarantee they made that choice, or their editor made them make that choice later, often the case. So overall, why is this narration versus dramatization important? Like I alluded to earlier, there's the issue of proportion. So readers will assign importance to the amount of space you give on the page. So give page space in proportion to importance. This comment appears on almost every manuscript I ever edit because it's people who aren't willing to kill their darlings when their darling is this beautiful party scene, which does not need to be dramatized, right? And if you have 3 chapters dedicated to something, your readers will look at it and be like, wow, that's a pretty good chunk of this book. I need to be really paying attention to what's happening here. And if it was just the writer having fun and really getting into the details of the fancy dresses, it's going to be a pacing problem. So again, the emphasis. The more page space you give, the more emphasis you are giving. the more emphasis, the bigger the promise, intentional or unintentional, to the reader. So imagine, for example, that you as the author are in a dimly lit room and you have a reader with you, and you as the author have a flashlight, and you can go and shine the flashlight on whatever you want in this room. There's a couple in the corner, they're arguing. Maybe you have the flashlight on them for a good while because it's pretty exciting and we want to hear what they have to say. And then maybe you'd show a picture on the wall and you realize that it's the couple 20 years ago. And then you focus on what looks like a stain on the floor. And you hold the flashlight on there for like 15 seconds. The reader's going to be like, oh, that's probably blood, right? If that was inconsequential and you just thought you had a really cool description because it kind of looked like the state of California or whatever, you just gave that stain on the floor emphasis. You gave the reader the impression that is an important clue that they should be putting into their brains, right? So if you didn't want that to happen, you don't hold your flashlight there. You don't give things of minor importance by spending a lot of time on them. And again, like we said, the pacing. Proper pacing will keep your readers engaged. That means it can't be too slow. You don't want to do all showing, but you also don't want to go too fast and do all telling. If you read a few chapters that's nothing but telling, you're just like, you don't feel engaged. Your eyes might start kind of sliding over because maybe there's not even concrete images to fasten onto. It gets abstract real fast. So you want to fast forward and slow down on purpose. So if you have one takeaway from this presentation, I want it to be, think about being very purposeful with when you are showing versus telling. Don't let it be but I really think that scene is cool. Do it because it needs to be there. Do it because you're shining the flashlight in the proper areas. And this is a cool quote from Guy de Maupassant, which, anybody remember him from high school English? I remember having to read some of his stories. That's the only time I was like, oh, Guy de Maupassant, I remember that. So the writer's goal, what's that? Yes. So the reason why we fast forward and slow down is because fiction is not like real life. Real life is kind of boring a lot of the time, which is probably a good thing. But literature, on the other hand, presents cleverly orchestrated events and concealed transitions, like we're talking about, beginnings of chapters, switching between time and space, essential incidents highlighted, flashlight, by the writer's skill alone. In giving every detail its exact degree of shading in accordance with its importance, the author produces the profound impression of the particular truth he wishes to point out. Right? So it's through the purposeful decisions of when you're showing and when you're telling will build the story in the image that you wanted to present to your reader. So that was all the macro. So now we can look at the micro, which is, again, the sentence and word level. And you'll see a lot of crossover here, but it is a bit different in a lot of ways. So showing, again, we are describing things that's going on around us. We are getting sensory details. So if you can see it, hear it, feel it, touch it, smell it, then you are showing. Dialogue, internal thoughts, again, that is, you are hearing their words, or we are thinking their words, I guess, when it's thoughts. It is specific, yet it is also nuanced. And that sounds like those are contrary, but they're really not. The more specifically you describe how somebody looks, the more the reader gets to do that interpretation. Remember, we talked about the passive versus the active reading experience. So the more specific you are, the less abstractions you use, the more the reader has to think, and so the more nuance, they are bringing their own experiences to the book. So it paints a picture, or it plays a song, or picture is very visual, but think in all terms of all the senses. So the reader gets to draw conclusions about what they are being told or shown. But it can also be very wordy. And again, that's why we don't always want to show. Telling, on the other hand, you are explaining something to a person. He was mad. You're just on the nose telling them what is going on. So like you see a couple bullets down there, it's vague, You're using abstractions. Angry. Angry is an abstraction. You can't see angry. You see the manifestations of anger. So it's narrated descriptions. It's summarized, again, so it is more concise. It's just flat out states what happened and allows the reader to be passive. It was a hot day. He was angry. It sounds like a children's book for its simplicity, because children, very young children, don't necessarily want to have to interpret everything that they're reading. But again, telling it is very concise, and sometimes we need to be concise. Sometimes we just want to flick the flashlight past the stain on the floor to show the important stuff over here. So a few examples, like we keep talking about, the mom was angry. That's fine. If that's not very significant to the story, great. Say mom was angry and move on. Or you can show it. So mom grimaced and slammed her fist on the table. Right, we're seeing visuals, we're getting physical movement, we're hearing things. How could you do this to me? Mom yelled. We're getting real-time dialogue. We're being shown how angry mom is here. Another example, the telling version, the kitchen was cozy. So in some situations, that's totally fine. Say your character is going to buy a new house and they're walking around, and maybe we don't need to have every room described in great detail, particularly if this is not the house they end up actually buying. Sometimes it's enough to just say, hey, the kitchen was cozy. You move on. Sometimes, though, you want to linger. You don't want to be fast-forwarding. You want to slow down. So, the aroma of warm cinnamon rolls enveloped me when I stepped into the kitchen. I think I was hungry when I was writing this. Be forewarned, there's a few more of these. Though it was snowing outside, the heat from the oven and the soft lights of the candles warmed me immediately. Right? So we're getting scent, we're getting sensations of heat and warmth, we're getting visuals of the candles, we're also getting how the character's feeling. So a reader would read the aroma of warm cinnamon rolls envelop me when I stepped into the kitchen and think, oh, that does sound nice, right? You feel like you're in their shoes. You might think, oh, that does sound nice and cozy. I want some cinnamon rolls, right? So, again, food. So when is it a good idea then to show on this kind of micro level? And that it really is when you want the experience to be immersive, when you want your reader to be sitting at that table with the scent of cinnamon rolls and the warm oven and the candles. That's when you want to show. When you want your character to feel like they are inside the character's head. We want to get their thoughts as things are unfolding. When you want to really establish a setting. I mean, obviously, when a lot of authors will write setting in a very telling way. They will say, and the fields were over here. There was, almost omniscient, or often omniscient, like there were acres of fields over here, and then the corn led up to the front porch of the White House, and blah, blah, blah. That is still narrating, because we are not actually in a head sitting there seeing it through somebody's eyes, right? So if you want to establish a setting through your character, you need to actually show it dramatized. And when you want readers to feel something, nobody feels anything when they hear mom is angry. It's very bland, right? If you want your character to feel, or you want your reader to feel bad for your character, have them experiencing mom shouting and hitting things. Then you start to feel what the character is feeling. You can't tell somebody and make them feel something. And when you want readers to come to their own conclusions, again, we all bring our own experiences, our own baggage to a reading experience, so maybe not everybody's going to even interpret the scene the same way. Somebody who had an abusive mother, for example, might feel very differently about the scene than somebody who is a mother themselves, who maybe kind of throws things around sometimes, right? But you're allowing the reader to come to their own conclusions, to be more engaged in the process. So when does it make sense to tell on this kind of small level? When you want to convey ideas quickly. When you just need to present facts. Those transitional moments. 6 months later, blah, blah, blah. Avoiding repetition, like I talked about the shorthand. If you've done it before, now you can just say, I typed up another report. We don't need to see the process of you typing up another report. And when you want your language to be concise. then it is a fantastic idea to tell. And again, same with on the macro level. If you can tell and you don't lose any meaning, maybe you should be looking to tell. So, my favorite, blending show and tell. So even in a dramatized scene, you can use telling. And even in a narrated scene, you can use showing. So I definitely don't want to present this like it is a dichotomy. Weaving them together is really your best bet. I mean, think about like watching a TV show or watching a sports game. How about that? You're watching the Chiefs, and you're fast forwarding through a bunch of stuff because you're like, oh no, they're just running around. Oh, wait, this is exciting. Let me actually watch this when I know they do the game. Okay, let me fast forward. Okay, they're doing another good play. That's what your writing should feel like. Purposeful, fast forwarding, and slowing down. So, for an example of telling within a dramatized scene, this is from The Stepford Wives by Ira Levin, which it's a cool movie, but I've read the book. It's really a novella recently, and it is straight. It's really good. I recommend. If anybody's seen the movie, the book is even better, I think. So the example. Just a game then, Charmaine called. One more game, Joanna. All right, one more game. Charmaine won it. You killed me, but it was great, Joanna said as they walked off the court together. Thank you. So that is a pretty extreme example, right? We've got the dialogue, the characters are literally talking to each other in real time. We fast forward through that entire game. They're playing tennis here. Fast forward through their entire game of tennis. But I would argue that how succinct that is makes it work. I mean, if they said, it was a pretty good game, but Charmaine pulled it out in the end, no. Charmaine won it. We need to know that Charmaine just kicked her butt, basically, right? It is just on there and like, oh, okay, well, that was great. We don't need to see the game. I would argue it's much more powerful to just say, Charmaine won it, and then they move on. So an example of showing within a narrated scene. So, and this is from Afterward by Nina Schuyler, which, again, excellent book, highly recommend. So this is a scene. This was the beginning of a chapter. Again, we're talking about transitions, basically. This is a character who is taking an international flight. That would be a very long scene to actually dramatize, right? But she conveys the entire thing so well here by fast-forwarding, slowing down at the right moments. Late afternoon, Virginia lands at San Francisco International Airport. The plane ride was a roller coaster, battered and blustered by an electrical storm. Splashes of bright light outside the window. She spent most of the flight gripping her armrests of her seat, imagining her body hurtling through space, gasping for oxygen before plummeting into the Pacific Ocean. When they finally landed, she, along with the other passengers, pale-faced and jittery, stumbled down the ramp and into the busy airport. Years were subtracted from their lives. My God, muttered a middle-aged man shuffling beside her. My God. Isn't that good? I don't know, that's a really good book. And it's all well written like that. We have this kind of, she knows how to do just the perfect balance between the showing and telling. So we get little elements of what happened, and then at the end, we pull it in to a real-time scene, right? We actually have dialogue here. So again, a really good example of you don't have to have an entire scene that is all one or the other. This kind of blending is really the best way to go. So then we have montages, which are my favorite. So these can be great for showing the passage of time, and it can be great for showing a sense of ongoing events. And I will give some examples of this because I understand that's kind of abstract. But you can do a montage when you want a collapsed series of separate events. It's designed to give a sense of progress or a representative sampling of what things were like during like a specific time period. And basically it's a series of snapshots of showing strung together. So it's kind of like little vignettes of little mini scenes that you're just kind of clumping together to give kind of a bigger sense of what is happening, right? So think sports training montages. Think, is it Rocky IV that has a really good one where it's like cold and icy and he's like, yeah, that is montage. Or in fantasy novels or in fantasy movies, you'll see a lot of training montages. Somebody's like, I need to learn how to use a sword. Rather than showing, years of them learning this, you can give us little snapshots and get the same effect. Mulan, the movie. Such good montages in that movie. So it's used a lot in film for the sake of time, but I argue that you can use it very effectively in novels as well. And I'll give some examples. So I think both my examples, are from Bride of the Tornado by James Kennedy, which is a very strange book. And it's weird, creepy tornadoes. If you're Midwestern, I highly recommend giving it a read because it is excellent. So here's an example of a passage of time montage. So I spent that year mostly alone. I played video games at the bowling alley alone, and my high scores stayed on the machines unchallenged. I swam in the quarry alone, even though people had drowned there, but plunging down to the bottom of the cold water felt so good. I went to the thrift store alone, and I bought clothes that felt haunted, and books that felt forgotten, and knickknacks that seemed from another planet, and I couldn't understand why I was the only one from school who'd get stuff there. So it even starts out saying, so I spent that year mostly alone. So we know that we're covering an entire year's worth of content here, essentially, right? And you can kind of picture this. If this were a film, you'd be like, okay, here's her doing video games on an arcade machine all by herself. Here's her swimming. Here's her going to the thrift store, right? You can imagine what that would look like visually. But you can do it in one paragraph in a book as well, and it can be very effective. Here's another one from, again, Bride of the Tornado. So this is an ongoing events montage. So I'll read it, and then we'll talk a little bit more about what that means. So people would stop whatever they were doing and watch the sky entranced. Drivers would pull over and get out of their cars, standing in the fields, staring at the clouds. People washing dishes would catch a glimpse out the window and leave the water running as they slowly walked into their backyards, their eyes fixed on the hypnotic sky, the tornadoes pulsing, multiplying and swelling, thicker and darker, squeezing us down, penning us in, coming for us, but there was nothing we could do. The tornadoes were terrifying, the tornadoes with death, and yet we couldn't stop staring, and I felt them staring back, like the tornadoes wanted to come close, like they had something to tell us. First of all, it's just gorgeous again, isn't it? I mean, that was a long sentence, you realize, when I started reading that out loud. But, so does anybody notice, the question there at the bottom, what repeated word clues us into the ongoing nature of that montage? Did anybody pick up on that? What's that? Would, exactly. People would stop whatever they were doing. Drivers would pull over. People washing dishes would catch a glimpse. I have a PhD in creative writing, but I don't know the grammar side so much. I'm not as much on the English side, so I don't know. If anybody knows what the official, the tense and whatever of that would is, let me know. But it's basically showing a habit, right? So it's like saying, oh, when I was young, we would often go to here, or I would spend my summers, blah, blah, blah. It's showing an ongoing habit, right? I'm not sure. That's the thing. I never can remember the terms. But it's used very effectively here. And maybe you'll start noticing it if you see a passage that has would, something would, and you're like, oh, wait, this is not happening in a single day. This is not even happening in a single year necessarily. They're saying this is what life is like in this kind of ambiguous zone, right? So montages, use them. They're delightful. So just to kind of recap what we talked about. So I argue that there are two types of show and tell. The macro, which was the dramatization, versus the narration on that scene level and making the decision, am I going to fully write this out, or am I going to fast forward through the scene, only giving the important, pertinent information? And then for the micro, of course, individual lines. How in-depth am I going to get? Am I going to be giving sensory information or not? And you should slow down and show, or speed up and tell, to control your pacing. And if you realize that you're having pacing problems in your manuscript, go through, re-outline, and I look at every scene, every chapter, and think, am I doing the right thing here? Is this a place where I should be speeding up, and I need to change this to a narration instead of a dramatization, or vice versa? And then, of course, blending is best. You really, I don't want to say never again, it's a terrible, bad habit, but it is a good idea to use both, even if you're just doing it at your transition points, even if you're starting your chapters with just a little bit of narration to ground everybody. Oh yeah, 2 weeks later, we met up again in the bar at night. Boom, we got enough information, then drop us into your scene, right? But the main point, like I said, is that you really should be making purposeful decisions. Don't stumble into show versus telling. Do it because that's what your scene, what your paragraph needs and deserves. So, all right. Does anybody have any questions? There in the back.
All my English classes, it was show, don't tell.
Yes.
So
Drives me nuts.
to hear show versus tell, like this gives me a new perspective because I always felt like I need to tell or show.
Excellent.
How do you see a difference in short stories versus like a novel in the amount of show versus telling? And also, in one class I was told everything should be in the first person. Another class I was told everything should be in the third person because first person you're getting their thoughts, but third person you're letting them come to their own conclusions. Do you have opinions about either of those?
Oh, lots. So the first part of the question was, do I notice a difference in like short fiction as compared to novel length fiction in terms of how much showing versus telling? And honestly, not so much, because I can think of examples of like flash fiction, which is a format I like, which is under 1,000 words. I actually was a slush pile reader for flash fiction online for 4 years and read a lot of very bad flash fiction. And a lot of good stuff too. You got to pick out the little gems, but I've read a lot. And honestly, some flash fiction will be 100% showing. Others will be almost entirely telling, and it really is just depending on the style you're going for. Again, personally, I think blending is best. I like a short story, which we get really sensory stuff, and then maybe like a scene break. And then we get dumped in, get more very sensory stuff, scene break with just a short transition. So you do have to be way more careful when you're using short fiction because you just don't have the word count sometimes to go in lengthy descriptions because every word count. You know, the shorter you get, the closer you're getting to poetry is really how I think of it. So if you have 1,000 words versus 10,000 words, obviously you can do a lot more showing in the 10,000 than you could in the 1,000. You have to be, more clever about it. And then the second part of the question was first person point of view versus third person point of view and how that relates to show versus tell. And honestly, again, it depends because you can get just as in-depth in somebody's head in third person as you can in first person. I mean, I can even argue that you can get more in-depth because we're not always truthful with ourselves. You know, we lie to ourselves or we don't see ourselves accurately, whereas a third-person narrator who is just in your head can present you more accurately than you can present yourself. So I don't think that that would make an effect on showing versus telling, though, either. I mean, it really is, it comes down to stylistic choice, word length, etc. So definitely can do either. I've done first person, I've done third person. Always very close, though, but they're all good. Any other questions? Yeah.
This is kind of more of like just a thought that I had, and maybe you have some advice for how to pull this off.
Sure.
But I also noticed that like some authors can kind of subvert some of these expectations too. Like they can spend a lot of time showing something and then never bring it up again. And then I find myself like thinking back to like, why did they spend so much time on that? And I kind of realized, like, actually that did have a major thematic element, even though maybe it wasn't part of the conflict or the conclusion. And then on the flip side, too, of, like skirting past something that later becomes really important. So do you have any kind of, like, advice, maybe, for how to pull that off?
Yeah, so the question was difficult to summarize. So the purposefulness of lingering on a scene or an object and whether that can be used to show maybe something that you don't realize the point of it until maybe even the very end of the story, and looking back, you're like, oh, wait, that did have a purpose. It just wasn't immediately obvious. Or, well, I mean, it also comes down to genre, too. I mean, if you are putting in red herrings in your mystery, you are going to be shining the flashlight over here at a significant object, knowing that the halo of the light is also shining a light on the book sitting next to it. And we later realized, no, the book was the significant part. It was a purposeful misdirection. So that is a great tool when you can pull it off. And I think that the best way to do it, though, is you really need to have reader feedback to see how it's landing, because you could hand somebody a manuscript and they'd be like, well, obviously you were talking about the book the whole time. And you're like, okay, I need to pull it back, make it more subtle, or make it more obvious if people are like, I don't remember the book being in there at all. You're like, no, it was in the halo of light when I talked about the statue, right? So the finessing of those kinds of elements, really, you need to have somebody else read it and tell you, did they pick up on it? Did they not? And if they, and then adjust accordingly. It's really the only way to do it that I know. Yeah.
This is a really good question, just like something I like to do when I'm showing in a scene
Okay.
is like, I like to show things in a way that reflects the character's personality.
Yes.
Like characterization through showing, and I just think that's a fun thing to do. Like, I could be wanting to describe a rural field, like just on the side of a highway, and if my character was like really happy and saw the good things in life, I'd be like, look at the wild flowers and the pretty clouds, and if the character was negative, I'd be like, look at that ugly billboard or the broken down cars in the field and the barbed wire fence. Like,
Absolutely.
that's one of my favorite things to do, and even like describing the same thing, you can show it in a positive or negative way with metaphors. Like, I have a character who describes the pink walls in her room as like Benadryl pink or Pepto-Bismol pink, like some sort of medicine thing. But if you described it as bubblegum pink, it would be like happy.
Totally different feeling. Yeah.
So it's just something I think is fun, and I don't know, you could probably overuse that. But I just like
It's true, and brief summarize there for the online folks. The speaker was saying that they like to use showing and description as a way of demonstrating characterization, which is definitely something that I recommend. And it is easier when you are, because you should, when you can, particularly when you're describing settings or objects and things like that, do double duty, and get your personality of your character across. If you have two different people walk into a kitchen and then there's a dirty knife on the counter, you're going to have very different impressions if you're the wife and mother who has to do the dishes and they're like, oh, now I got to go wash that knife. They'd be like, oh, the annoying knife over there, versus somebody who is maybe the person who dirtied the knife and they feel guilty about it. They're going to be looking at the same object very, very differently, right? So that is a good idea to use infuse as much personality into your descriptions as you can. I'll say Douglas Adams, if anybody's a Douglas Adams fan, does this so well just by individual word choice. We use hilarious descriptions that don't make sense except for that character to use that description. Yes, he did the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy series and the Dirk Gently series are both, fantastic. So shout out to Douglas Adams. Yes?
Do you have, within, like, when you're looking at a manuscript, a way that you can categorically, like, either by highlighting or marking, to see if you're in balance?
I personally don't do that, but one definitely could. I mean, you could just go through whether physically, like print out a manuscript or a story, or do it, in Word or Scrivener or what have you, and highlight entire sections and be like, let me look at this. Yellow is showing and blue is telling, and just see how it looks. But I think the better sense, though, or the better way to do it, because there's not really, you shouldn't be like, well, it's got to be 50-50, and oh, no, I'm 60-40, it's off. You have to feel it. Or you give it to a reader and say, how does this feel? Did it drag at some point? So while you definitely can do that, it might not be as informative as you would hope, because there's no ideal ratio, I guess, Any other questions? Well, again, I do have bookmarks, cards. Feel free to look through the book, but thank you so much to everybody for attending. This was fun. Thank you. All right, enjoy the rest of your day. Yeah. comments.
I'm working on a short story that I'm actually transitioning into a screen thing.
Oh, okay, yeah.
But this, when you say show and tell, I was going back through my professor's notes about the story. And he's like, yeah, it's going along great. And then all of a sudden you describe things and it's